There we go. Okay. So the first thing I want to just make sure that we have clarity around, because I find that my intent is to kind of go through some scenarios and some scripts, and then kind of run through some strategies, answer any questions along the way. But the first thing I wanted to throw out to you is a concept, because this concept I find gets a lot of people in trouble when they represent buyers and they're in multiple offer scenarios. So let me ask you this question. What, if anything, does the listing agent and or the seller owe you and your buyers? Dawn says nothing. Any other answers?
Fairness.
Fairness. Okay. What else?
The listing agent owes their fiduciary to the seller. They don't owe anything to me or the buyer.
Yeah. So let's be clear that the answer of nothing is the right answer, right? They don't owe anything. And what I find is that sometimes when I have conversations with agents about multiple offers, they get stuck in that entitlement spot of, well, but they didn't even come back to us and to give us an opportunity to raise our offer. Minimally, they owed us that. No, they didn't owe you that. They don't owe you anything, right? One would like to think that fairness and honesty and fair dealings are on the table at all times. I learned over time not necessarily to expect that either, which sometimes you get it and sometimes you don't, right? So just remember that if anything is going to happen to help facilitate your win when you represent a buyer in a scenario like this, it's got to be done by you. Don't assume that someone's going to come back to you and ask you for another bite at the apple. Don't assume that the offer you're putting in will have an opportunity to be improved, right? Because sometimes people make different decisions. They make fast decisions, and then you get cut out. The biggest issue that I see when that kind of thing happens is that when the agent has gone to the buyer and very specifically said, no, typically what will happen is we'll put this in, we'll have an opportunity, they'll come back, they'll give us highest and best, you'll have another chance, don't worry. I would, if it were me, I think I would, if you're saying those things, I would stop that immediately, because that is, it's not factual. And oftentimes it puts you in a position to have to go back and say, oh, guess what? They didn't do what I thought they would do, right? And now it starts to be your fault instead of just the scenario's fault, right? So just be careful about that. So first and foremost, are you asking the question when you speak to the listing agent prior to the, let's just kind of set a couple of foundational ground rules for multiple offers on the buyer side. When you call the listing agent to have a discussion, are you asking a certain set of questions? Starting with, I'm curious, Dawn, do you currently have any other written offers? Like, I want to know what the listing agent is working with. And I like to put that word written in there, because sometimes listing agents like to say, oh yeah, we have a whole lot of interest. We're told we're getting an offer. How many written offers do you have? Right? Because that's what matters. Are you asking what the seller's close date of choice is? Right? Because that's another piece, that's another tool that if you can not have to negotiate the closing date because you've already asked the listing agent when they want to close, and your buyers don't care when they close, it's one less thing that gets in the way of getting to a yes, right? So I would definitely be asking those questions. And so when you ask the question of the listing agent how many written offers they currently have, you'll get an answer that is either 0 or we're expecting, right? We have none now, but we're expecting other offers, or we already have 3 or 1 or 17, whatever the scenario is. And each of those scenarios you have to play just a little bit differently. So an expectation setting script that I find really useful when you know that multiple offers is likely, and I would use this even before you get to the stage of multiple offers, then say it again when you know there's a multiple offer. But if I'm heading out with a buyer this weekend or tomorrow, and you know that multiple offers is rampant out there, set the expectation. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, today's marketplace is moving faster than it has in years. And that means that the best houses are going fast and sometimes with multiple offers. I want you to know that I am skilled in strategies that can help you win in a multiple offer situation. And if we get there, we can discuss those strategies further. But tell them before you go out for the first time that you're likely to run into multiple offers. That's just what's real right now, right? I find that when you set that early expectation, when it actually happens, you don't get the, oh no, now we have to fight, forget it, I want to run in the opposite direction, because they've been preparing for the fight, right? I watched the movie Troy again last night. Did you ever see the movie Troy? Brad Pitt plays Achilles between the Greeks and the Trojans. They have to be ready to go to war. And if you're not preparing them to go to war, they think they're going for a walk in the park. And a walk in the park is different than going to war, right? To win.
Mm-hmm.
Boy, Bogdan, you got high hair today. Come into the market center. I'll buzz it for you. Bzzz. That's what I've been doing.
I'm working on an appointment with my barber.
And so then when you already know that there's a multiple offer, right, you get to go back to the buyer. First and foremost, I want you to remember, and some of this is as a review from our buyer consultation conversations that we've had. I want you to remember that how you approach multiple offers or anything really with your buyers is how they will approach the solution. So if you approach the buyers with, oh God, guess what? The listing agent just told me, wouldn't you know it, the one that you like already has 2 offers on it. And I know that sounds dramatic, and yet I also know that we have tons of agents who approach it exactly that way. That they set the expectation that somehow this is being done to us, right? That's living in emotion, not living in objectivity. You've got to live in fact, and just simply set the stage for the buyer to say, hey, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, the listing agent just indicated to me that there is another offer on the property. Please note you're going to be given an opportunity to have your offer heard because that's what the listing agent just told you, right? Present it, and I'll present it. What do you want to do? It's always their choice. What do you want to do? Well, let's move forward. Great, right? It's objective. We're taking that next step. So here are strategies that you can begin to employ now that we've got some foundational stuff off the table or on the table. As I said before, make an offer with the closing date that the seller prefers. Remove any obstacle that you can possibly remove. One of the things that I used to do if I asked the listing agent for a date, when do the sellers want to close, and they didn't give me one, I would write in, instead of choosing a date and hoping it was close, I would write in at seller's discretion. If my buyers didn't care and it was multiple offers, I would just simply write in at seller's discretion. So now the listing agent gets to go to the sellers and say, you get to kind of close whenever you want. And that becomes a benefit to the offer for your buyers because there's one less thing to argue about, right? Of course, make the financing look as good as possible. This could mean putting more down up front, right? Typically we do 1%, then another 9%, or some version of that. In a multiple offer, if they're putting 10% down, why not just encourage them to write it up and put the whole 10% down up front? It's still not necessarily at risk, right? Until or unless a certain sequence of events happens, and it shows the sellers that you mean business, right? So make the financing look as good as possible. Pre-approval letters versus these preliminary letters that don't really say anything. Make sure that the pre-approval letter, if they're mortgaging money, make sure the pre-approval letters actually say something, that it states that their income and their assets have been verified, not just verbally. I'd want to know that if I were the listing agent to help the sellers make better choices about people who are in fact qualified. It could also mean paying cash, right? Some of your buyers have the ability to pay cash and they simply choose not to. In a multiple offer scenario, I would encourage them to haul that cash out and then just refi it after the fact, because cash can sometimes really sway a seller, because now they don't have to worry about an appraisal or the buyer being approved for financing. Now, again, I know all of these scenarios don't happen all the time, and yet some of them happen some of the time. So I want to make sure that you're ready with any of these particular strategies. The other thing I would encourage you to do, if you can find loan officers who have this kind of product or option available, I'm pretty certain both Loan Depot and Westport Mortgage do have this available. They can write you, I call it a TBD letter, right? And so your buyers can obtain a document that says they've pretty much gone through the underwriting process. The TBD is the address. We just have to stick an address in. So it's not just pre-qualified, it's not just pre-approved, because none of that really means a whole lot. This is pre-underwritten. And so talk to the loan officers that your folks are working with right now. And again, if they can't do it, tell your folks to call one of our partners, because they can do it. And they literally ask for additional documentation. They send that documentation to the underwriter, and the underwriter takes a look at all of the information just as if they were actually applying for a loan on a house. And they do all of that up front, so that now you have a document that says, look, all that's done. We just got to stick a property address in here and we're pretty much ready to close. That's a powerful alternative to waiving a mortgage contingency, right? We're going to talk about that in a minute. Do everything you can do up front. Pre-schedule inspections. It's another way to show that that the buyers really mean business, just like putting extra money down up front to weight things in your favor. When you work with the same inspector all the time, what I used to do is I used to call my inspector and say, hey, Ross, guess what? I got another one for you, but we don't have an offer on it yet. However, I expect to in the next 24 hours. So I want you to put us down for, or in the next couple of hours, put us down for noon tomorrow. And submit the offer with inspections scheduled already for noon tomorrow, because it sends a message to the sellers that your buyers are serious and that we're not wasting any time. Write a cover letter. If you're not typically writing cover letters, multiple offers are a perfect opportunity to sell the human beings that you represent, not just the numbers that go along with the human beings, right? So write a big mushy letter. Talk about how much they love it, or have them write it. People oftentimes say to me, well, you want to be careful. You don't want to love the property too much because it could put people at a negotiating disadvantage. Guys, we're talking about multiple offer strategies. They're already at a negotiating disadvantage. That's just the way it works, right? So you might as well tell the sellers how much you love it and every single reason why it's the best property on the planet, because some sellers are swayed by that. Not everyone, but some are. Make sure that you talk about the the buyers, talk about their family, talk about whatever you can that might pique the interest of the seller. Make sure, of course, that if they're not writing it, the buyers aren't writing the cover letter, that you get their approval with what you write before you send it. Another strategy, waive stuff. Waive stuff. What do I mean by that? You have to be a little bit careful with the waiving stuff, right? It only goes with consultation with the buyers and other people involved in the process. But sometimes in the scenario where you're perhaps overpaying for the property, you may waive the appraisal contingency, right? Because oftentimes there's an appraisal contingency in there. Even if you're not writing an appraisal contingency in, if you waive the appraisal contingency, it may save you from being asked to waive the mortgage contingency. If they're waiving stuff, they have to know what the downside is. So you have to have this consultation, have this conversation. If they waive their appraisal contingency and the property doesn't appraise, they have to be willing to put more money down, right? It doesn't necessarily change the price of the house. They just have to be in a cash position to finance a little bit less and bring a little more to the table. A lot of times your buyers are in a position to do that, and yet they freak out because they think that if it doesn't appraise, somehow they're making a bad decision. You have to help them understand ahead of time that if the property doesn't appraise, that's just simply a function of math. It's not a comment on them making a mistake. People buy properties for more money than the appraisal all the time, right? That's just a choice that they make. So again, this is expectation setting. Don't set up an appraisal with the expectation that the bank will come and justify what you're paying or not. Because the second you make it a justification, if it doesn't appraise and they're paying more, now they feel suddenly like they're overpaying. Nobody wants to feel like they're overpaying. We'll talk about some scripts about overpaying in a second. Waiving the mortgage contingency. Make sure they understand that there are some cons to that, right? It could put them in a position of not being able to turn around and walk away from the property because they don't have any outs built in. And yet, for some buyers, based on some purchases, they could well be okay waiving that mortgage contingency. I'd have a clear conversation with them and have them have a conversation with their loan officer to know what the risks are. Right, when I buy my little $150,000 multifamilies, I waive the mortgage contingency all the time. Because Karen writes my loans, I know that it'll be approved. There's no risk there to me. If you have buyers who are in a similar position where maybe they're not buying a huge property so that the money is lower, maybe they have cash backups that if they didn't get the mortgage, they could buy cash even though they weren't interested in spending the cash up front, right? So just help them see all the different possibilities to set up the best case scenario possible. They could waive inspection if they so chose. Again, when you start to waive stuff, you're talking about risk, and as long as they understand the risk, right? Waiving an inspection, if you have a seller with multiple offers, and we live in an as-is state where the seller has zero obligation to address anything that comes to the table, the only real risk there in waiving that is you discover something that's expensive, and now you don't have a right to back away from the property. Right? But for some buyers in certain scenarios, maybe you have a buyer who's a contractor who is going to do a once through of the house himself or herself just to see what they see, and the inspection's only going to be for like the septic and the roof or something. I don't know. You get my point though, right? So you can start waiving things, but you need to make sure that they understand the risks involved in waiving things. here's an important strategy. And you need to have this conversation up front. And for those of you who aren't adept at saying these words, you need to practice them. And the strategy is pay more money. And as buyer's agents, sometimes we get weirded out by having a conversation with a buyer that says, look, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, there are a couple of things that we can do to strengthen your offer. The biggest one, the most impactful thing that we can do is you can choose to pay more money. And if you have a conversation with them, right, that says, look, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I told you in the beginning that I was skilled in helping you win multiple offers, and the last thing that I enjoy doing is telling people to spend more money. However, in certain circumstances, spending more money is exactly what's required for you to come out on top. And this is one of those circumstances. Right, and we'll get to the next part of that script in a second. But that's just helping the buyer understand that sometimes it's not about the market, it's not about the listing agent who didn't come back and offer you another opportunity. It's not about anything. The reason you're losing houses in multiple offer scenarios is because you're not willing to pay. And sometimes you helping them see that paying more money gets them the win is what's needed to then help them actually do that. Now, one of the things we know is that sometimes more money doesn't always do what we hope it will do, right? Dawn, can we talk about your scenario?
Of course. Go ahead.
Right. So Dawn and I were talking over the weekend, strategizing how to assist her buyers in getting a multiple offer property where they bid $40,000 over the list price. I have that right, Ed?
Yep. Sorry.
Right, $40,000, and they did that, and this was a property in the sevens, guys. They did that because the sellers had already sort of said yes to somebody, right? I guess they didn't have anything that locked them into that, but they had already agreed to accept somebody else's offer. So Dawn's folks went in strong, and unfortunately it ended up backfiring because the sellers were afraid that they went in strong enough that they were going to wake up the next morning with buyer's remorse and say, what are we doing? Or 2 days from now or 3 days from now, right? So it is a balancing act. I mean, is there anything else, Dawn, that I'm leaving out of that story?
Yeah, we waived the mortgage, the appraisal contingency, and I showed them comps that of other houses we had been interested in that were in the price range that we put the offer in at, and thinking that this house was somewhat underpriced to have as many offers as they did. But again, that didn't help either. So.
Yeah, as you're saying that to me, I wonder if this is like a day late and a dollar short because
Yeah, thanks, Rick.
But I wonder in a scenario like what you faced, and I will tell you, I've had sellers in the past be worried about that. I was so surprised when Dawn came back later in the day and said, so that didn't go our way because the sellers went back to the first offer because they were freaked out about what we were paying. I've never actually had that personally happen to me, right? And so that was the first time dealing with a seller who got too freaked out. I wonder if utilizing those comps would have helped the seller see that the appraisal was like, here's the decision we made. This is why we're willing to pay you this much, right? Because the comps that we believe the appraisal will use, the property likely will appraise, which is we're willing to pay this much, and we're willing to waive the appraisal contingency because of these data points.
Yeah, that's why I provided those houses and like what my clients liked and what they bid on before, so yeah.
Yeah. So it's another perfect example of none of this stuff works 100% of the time, right? I mean, because you're dealing with human beings, people make different decisions and different choices. And I'm still convinced that what's going to happen in that scenario is the first buyers are going to flake out in some way, shape, or form. And then the next conversation with Dawn's buyers will be, okay, so are you still willing to pay all the way up here? Because now we're coming back to you. And then Dawn's buyers are going to say, well, oh, that's awesome, except now we want to pay you here because you screwed us up over here. So we'll see. Dawn will keep us all posted on that.
Keep you posted. Hopefully that will happen.
Right, but so I mentioned that story simply because sometimes it is a balancing act, right? Because I'm going to give you a script right now and a concept to help buyers make decisions about where they want to come in. That sometimes they sometimes have to consider the other side of that. Going too high may create other issues, right? So after you let the buyer know that this is one of those circumstances where paying more money will likely help them come out on top, you get to then have a conversation about how they proceed. So Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, in my experience, when there are two offers on a property, one buyer is typically at the asking price and the other is typically below it. You'll have to choose which of those buyers you want to be. Right? Give them an opportunity to be at asking price or below it by utilizing your experience. Think about it. When you have a two offer, multiple offer scenario, 9 times out of 10, somebody meets the standard of the asking price and somebody's going to be below it. Here's the other thing to remember. In a multiple offer situation, the asking price is now the minimum standard set by the sellers. With multiple offers, like the asking price, buyers and buyer's agents don't really get to have a conversation around, well, the asking price is too high, right? Because the second there's more than one offer, that asking price becomes kind of a benchmark. So help the buyers understand that. If there are more than two offers on the property, you get to have the same conversation, except that goes like this. In my experience, when there are multiple offers on a property, there's typically a buyer at asking price, a buyer above asking price, and somebody else below, or everybody else below. You'll need to choose which of those buyers you want to be. Do you see how these scripts help them self-select how strong they want to be? This isn't you saying, look, you're going to have to go over asking price. Instead, this is you setting the table saying, look, here's what this typically looks like. Who do you want to be? If you want to be the one below asking price, so maybe they say that, well, we want to be the one down here because like we're not interested in getting into a bidding war. Okay, well, you're already in that, just by the way, because you're making an offer with other people. So you're already in that. And I just want to reiterate that in my experience with multiple offers, there's somebody at asking, somebody above, and typically everyone else is below. And so I'm curious, knowing that you'd like to go in below, how do you reconcile that with coming out on top? How do you reconcile that choice with the win? Again, I'm here to support whatever choice you make. You told me you wanted to live in that house. And so how do you reconcile those two things? Help them self-discover the choices they have to make to come out on top. If the asking price was the simple expectation that the seller set that's now become the minimum standard, how does coming in below that help you to win? Do you see that to stand a chance, minimally you have to say yes to the asking price? I get these are hard conversations for some of you to have because some of you have brainwashed yourselves over time that your job is to help the buyer buy the house for as little money as possible. That's not really your job. Unless the buyer says to you, we want to pay as little money as possible. And then in a multiple offer scenario, you get to ask the question back. So I get that. I'm curious, which is more important to you? Coming out on top or paying as little as possible? Because in a multiple offer scenario, you typically don't get to have both. So which is more important to you? Allow me to guide you along the plane of the one that's more important to you. You see how that works? The other piece of that is using what I call the insurance mechanism. So Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, there are times when in order to come out on top, you not only have to meet the seller's expectation, you have to exceed it. And so if you choose to be that person who's above the asking price, I want you to think of how much money you offer over and above the asking price as insurance. How safe you want to be will determine how much insurance you buy. So with all that in mind, what do you think you want to do? Right? Any dollar over the asking price, I love the correlation between that and insurance. Now again, how do you reconcile that with Dawn's scenario where they've overbought insurance, they bought too much insurance? You don't. Because again, not all these things work 100% of the time. I can tell you though, in 21 years, that's the first time that someone didn't, that I know of, that someone didn't move forward with a buyer because they thought it was too high, that we couldn't get them to see the opportunity in these particular buyers. I sometimes wonder too, if there were other reasons why they moved to the other offer that they just didn't talk about, right? We don't oftentimes get 100% of the information back.
So I think sometimes a couple of things the agent said that it might be because they already said they would accept that offer. So they're, they want to be nice people and not have extra money in their pocket, but they already committed, they already said yes. So.
Yeah. And I think all of us have seen a version of that, right? Where people make decisions that have nothing to do with the highest amount of money. They sometimes make decisions based on being connected or the cover letter or the financing terms. Like maybe the other offer was cash. Maybe maybe it was just because they already said yes to that person and they're going to move forward and keep their word. Sellers will make a whole lot of different decisions, and we're going to talk on the listing side in just a few minutes. I want you to be really clear, though, that every one of those little scripts I gave you ended with, so with all that in mind, what do you choose to do? Right? It's always about the buyers making a choice. Because if you start telling them what to do, that's where you start to feel like you're strong-arming people, right? That's where they don't necessarily feel strong-armed if they win, but if they don't win, then they go back to, well, I was strong-armed to make this decision. I didn't even want to do this, and that didn't even work anyway, right? It all becomes your fault. So be really cautious around that. From a mindset perspective, I want you to remember that you're giving guidance to people. You're talking them through strategically on a house they said that they wanted to live in. I want to live there. And until they say to you something different, you need to keep pushing aggressively forward to help them do just that, to help them get that house. Which is why the script, sometimes paying more money is exactly what you have to do in order to come out on top, is so important. Because a lot of real estate agents have this funny notion that part of their job is to make sure that the buyer doesn't overpay for the property. How do I know that? Because I've heard it a million times. Oh, well, I didn't want them to overpay. Why not? That's not your choice to make, right? A lot of you know the story of the house that I currently live in. It was on the market for $639. It was my own listing. I paid $667 for that house because we just kept bidding it up. There was a bidding war over and over and over again. And everyone in my world kept saying to me, what are you doing? Why are you overpaying for that house by so much? And you know what? At some point, I have to be honest with you, I resented the people who were telling me that. Because that was a house that I wanted to purchase for reasons that made very good sense to me. And so to have everyone around me saying, you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't do that, why are you doing that? It was annoying. Because I get to spend my money the way I want to spend my money. So remember that your role in all of this is to help people see the good, the bad, and the in-between. You're the options people. Lay out all the options and then ask what they choose to do. If somebody chooses to quote unquote overpay for a house, now I bought that house 17 years ago. I overpaid $40,000 for it. I've lived there for 17 years. Do you think any of that matters, for God's sake? Right? None of it matters 17 years later. So be certain that you're having those conversations and helping people see that you're going to continue to point them in a direction of winning until they ask you to back down from that. Escalation clauses are something else that I want to throw your way as a strategy on the buyer side. Escalation clauses are this. It's a clause that you add to your offer when you know there's additional offers that says something like this. So Silva's now the listing agent. I'm going to hand Silva my offer that says these buyers, Tom and Maria Smith, are willing to pay $5,000 over the highest verifiable offer up to $675,000, right? The property's on for $649,000. And the reason it's called an escalation clause is because your buyers are taking the stand that whatever anybody else pays, I'm willing to escalate my offer by $5,000 up to a certain number. Now you can put a cap on it. I've seen escalation clauses that are uncapped. That gets a little dangerous sometimes, right? So I encourage you to cap them even if it's a high cap. Maybe $5,000 isn't enough to win the day. Maybe your escalation clause has to be for $8,000 or $10,000 over the highest verifiable offer. Here's a couple of thoughts on that. First and foremost, using that escalation clause, the first person that you may have to sell that to is the listing agent. Because we hear all the time from listing agents say things like, you can't do that, it's illegal. Okay, no it's not, first of all. You have to have a number in there. Well, we have a number. We just don't know what the number is. You know what the number is though, right? And they said, well, what are you talking about? Well, if your other offer is for $660, well, then you know that our number is $665. So you have a number. That doesn't seem fair. But life isn't fair. Let's just move on, right? And so the struggle sometimes is explaining the concept to a listing agent who's resistant to it. Because if you can't help the listing agent understand it, they're not going to explain it well to the seller.
Oftentimes they say the seller doesn't play this game.
Now, if in fact it comes back that the seller is unwilling to address an escalation clause, then the buyers have to make a decision, right? Because do the sellers have a right to say, I don't think I want to play that game? Sure they do, right? All day long and twice on Tuesday. So if the sellers choose not to, then that's okay. So someone's asking where the scripts are that I'm reading from. They're just in my notes. I'm happy to send my notes out via email this afternoon, so you can have my notes. I didn't prep it with they're just my notes, so some of them might say like tell this story. Just ignore that, but I'll send them out. It's not really a handout; it's just my notes.
Hey, Rick.
Yeah.
Hi. One objection I've heard to that prior is, well, then that means you didn't put your best foot forward. You know, when they're calling for best and final or highest and best.
Yeah.
With the escalation clause.
Sure.
You've heard that too.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole lot of things that come back with escalation clauses. I don't really believe that most of them are valid, and yet in a situation like that, you're put in the position of, you can either argue, which doesn't help your buyers move forward, right? Or you
Right.
can simply say, okay, well, that didn't work this time. Go back to the buyers and say, okay, so this is one of those scenarios where the escalation clause didn't do what we hoped it would do.
Sure.
In order to be considered, the sellers are asking for an actual number. So what number do we want to put on there,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
So here's the thing, even though they're valid and legal and all that stuff, it's a negotiation. And so both parties have to be willing to play the game in order to step forward. It's kind of like a seller coming back and saying, I don't like the form that you wrote your offer on. Please use this board's form. And there are some buyer's agents who argue and push back and fight against that. And I scratch my head and think, oh my goodness, just write it on the form that they want. What's the difference, right? Stop having to be right. Instead, do what's best for your buyer. Is it silly that they want it on that form? Well, maybe, but who cares, right? Even if it's a contract form, there's a reason they're asking for it. Maybe ask what the reason is, and then go back to the buyers and say, here's what they're asking for. Understand, even though it's a contract, built into this contract, there's still a 5-day rescission period for attorney review. So you're still safe, you're still okay, even though it's a contract, right? So a couple of last quickies on the buy side, then we'll have a quick conversation on the listing side. Comply with all deadlines, stay on top of the responses, right? The numbers, the dates you write into your offer mean something. They're not just fill in the blanks and you never look at them again, especially in a multiple offer scenario, because I have seen listing agents, myself included, who monitor those dates like a hawk. And the second that you're not on top of a date, you get a phone call from me saying, okay, like, Alice, what's the story with the mortgage contingency? It was due today. We haven't had a request for an extension. We're going to the other offer. Like, stay on top of those. Be proactive as the buyer's agent to make sure that you're moving things along. Here are a couple of really important ones. Be gracious when you win. Be gracious when you win, which means be objective. Wow, that's great news. You know what? We will not let you down. Here are the next steps as I see them, Dawn. As listing agent, what are you looking at for next steps? Let's like sync our watches and make sure that we're on top of all of this and get these folks to a closing. Even more important, be gracious when you lose. Be gracious when you lose. Let's talk about two sides of that. First and foremost, when you are the loser, the very first thing that you should be doing is asking another question. Wow, you're kidding. I'm curious. Is there anything that the buyers can do, that my buyers can do right now to change the seller's mind? Is there any number that would make sense for the sellers to hear? Is there anything that any adjustments we could or should make to the offer that allows them to say yes to us? Because here's what I've learned. When you ask that question, sometimes with some sellers and some listing agents, you actually get an answer. And when you deliver that answer back to the buyers, sometimes the buyers say, oh, we can do that. Like we're talking about $5,000 and we have a mortgage? Sure, we'll do that. And you get the win, even though you've been told you didn't get the win, right? Because you're the one who asked, what else can we do? And I think too oftentimes we hear that we were the losers and we don't keep pushing. We don't ask follow-up questions, right, of the listing agent. It doesn't matter what the answer is. You asking the question is what's important. Here's the other side of be gracious when you lose. If you think for 1 second that when I call you and tell you that the sellers decided to go with another offer, and you start screaming like a lunatic about how unfair it was and how you should have been given this and the buyers are so upset and you're mean and you're unethical, right? A realtor's favorite word when they're angry is the word unethical. I don't even think most of them know what it means. But everyone hauls that tried and true sucker out. Oh, you're so unethical. Oh, shut up. If you think that if you behave that way and I'm the listing agent, if something happens with the first offer, if you think I'm coming back to you first, only to have to deal with your craziness, you've now shown me that there is no way that I want to do business with you, because you you felt the need to berate me and tell me how unfair everything was and boo-hoo-hoo it, which means you're going to do the same thing when you go back to your buyers. So now, even if we did come back to your buyers later on, the buyers already view both me as the listing agent and the sellers as the enemy. And the transaction does not go as smoothly. It is such bad business. So please, if you take nothing else away from today, please don't be one of those screaming crazy people when you don't win a multiple offer situation. It is just bad. It's bad form, it's bad business, it's bad manners, it's bad chi, it's bad energy, it's just bad everything. And the last thing I want to throw your way as on the buyer side is don't take no for an answer. If you're not naturally good at this, you have to keep working that muscle, because not taking no for an answer is a skill, right? There are some of you who will get on the phone with your credit card company and ask for something and you're told no and you hang up the phone and you accept that. There are others of you who will be on the phone with the owner of Visa within 15 minutes because you just keep pushing to get the answer that you're looking for, right? In a scenario where you have a fiduciary duty to somebody else, you need to be that person who keeps pushing. Even if the listing agent says, you know what, I'm sorry, Rick, there's nothing else that you can do. I'm still going back to my buyers and saying, so I was just told they went in a different direction. They accepted another offer. I am curious. Is there anything else that you want to do to send me back to see if we can't displace the one that they just said yes to? Is there any amount of money you want me to add on to your offer? Is there anything you want me to waive? Is there any term you want me to adapt? And whatever they tell me, if they say no, great, then we hang out as a backup and we move on. If they tell me, you know what, we really should have paid $5,000 more, can you go back? Sure I can. I'm going to ask you one question before I go back, because you may have 0 bites left at the apple. If you have anything, you have this one last bite. Are you sure $5,000 is enough? And if I come back to you and say they said no again, are you going to say, you know what, we should have done 10? Because if you should have done 10 then, just do it now. And then go back to the listing agent, right? Most of you on this call have been on the list side. Sometimes you know it's not over till it's over. And if someone comes back and is all of a sudden waving around a checkbook, sometimes the sellers say, you know what, I think we can't say no to that now. So those are my thoughts and strategies on the buy side. Any comments, questions, concerns about the buyer side of things?
I have one.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry. In productivity coaching this morning, someone shared that this happened to them over the weekend, that the buyer presented a letter to the seller with the multiple offer situation, and the listing agent told the buyer's agent that they refused to present the letter because then it may turn into a lawsuit down the road of discrimination in case their offer is not accepted, because these people are coming from Europe.
They're coming from where?
Europe. So the listing agent is saying that if the sellers do not accept the offer, but they already knew from the letter, the way the buyers wrote the letter, that they're coming from Europe, it could turn into a lawsuit. So she or they refuse to present this letter to the seller. What would you say?
So what I would say is, yes, we run into those kinds of things all the time. I mean, first, let me go on record saying I completely understand, because those Europeans, they can be a little tricky, right?
Hey.
Oh, now I lost my train of thought. So yes, those kinds of things are going to pop up. Here's where how you don't win those scenarios. You don't win by saying things like, you have to do this, by arguing with the listing agent to say, no, my seller said that you have, and my broker said you have to do. If it were me, I would recall the offer. So I would have a conversation with my buyers and say, okay, allow me to recall the offer, and then whatever information you wanted them to read from the cover letter, write it in the offer. Now, can you be as eloquent and as long? No, but who cares? Beat the listing agent at their own game. Write it in the offer. And if for some reason everybody is just digging their heels in, you know what? Sometimes you just got to say, look, we can't control everything, right? We can't control everything. We put our best foot forward. Sometimes you just, you got to just move on, right? Me personally, I think that's kind of foolish, because I think by not delivering the information that was asked to be delivered, I think that's just as discriminatory as not accepting the offer, right? So I don't know what anyone's trying to prove. It's what happens when real estate agents try to play the police, the discrimination police, the ethics police, the any kind of police. We're not that, just in case anyone was curious. We're not any of those things, right? And when we step into that arena, it almost always just causes trouble. Let's talk a little bit about the list side in our remaining minutes. And there are a couple of things I want to make sure that we understand. First, let me ask you a question. As a listing agent, do you have a proactive duty to disclose multiple offers when they exist? So there's a lot of people saying no. Those people would be correct, right? And what that means is, until or unless your seller says, let everybody else know there are other offers on the table, you have no proactive duty to disclose that there's another offer on the table. That is always a conversation with you and your seller. It's certainly a conversation. I think Silva's trying to kiss me.
No, I want to say something.
Oh, okay. It looked very much like you were trying to kiss me on the screen.
I'm sorry. My sellers, several times that happened to me, they say, oh, do whatever you think is best. And then what?
So you don't accept that from sellers.
Okay.
You know, I so appreciate that. Unfortunately, I'm not in a position to make that decision. That does have to come from you. And so you tell me, right? Throw it right back at them. Or else we get ourselves in a position of making decisions on behalf of the client. We don't want that, right? So jot this down. As a listing agent, once you do have multiple offers, you have one main goal. And the goal is not to get the most money for the seller. That is a common misconception. The goal when you're the listing agent in a multiple offer situation is to ensure that everyone, including your seller, feels as though they were treated fairly in the transaction. That's your main goal. And the reason that's your main goal is because all the drama around multiple offers goes away if people feel like they were fairly treated. Even if they lose and they feel like they had a fair shot, there's at least less drama. And that's the best path for your seller, because the second drama creeps in, people start making different decisions about wanting to buy that house because they feel as though they're being treated unfairly. Does that make sense to everybody?
Rick?
Yes.
I have a quick question, if you allow me.
Of course.
As the listing agent, let's say we have two identical offers.
Yes.
On the table. One is very nice buyer, very nice agent. Everything is totally agreeable. They don't ask any questions. They just love the house and want to move in. The other ones start asking question after question after question after question, and this never ends. So as a seasoned listing agent, let's say I already see the trouble coming. Am I allowed to share my opinion, or just leave it up to the sellers and don't say nothing? Because
So I'll answer that.
obviously you understand what it would be, you know?
Yeah, I'll answer that question this way. The fiduciary responsibility you have to your seller as a listing agent is to give them all relevant information to help them make the best decision possible, right? Now, some of that relevant information might be opinion for you, right? If you had a bad experience with somebody one time, that might be an opinion. You may feel it's relevant. I'm not going to say it's wrong to have that conversation. I would put forth first and foremost, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I do want to just let you, I had a negative situation or a transaction with this particular person. It did happen one time. It was 6 years ago. I've never had an issue again. I just feel like I should disclose that to you in case that makes a difference, right? Make sure they know what's opinion and what's fact. And make sure that if the scenario I just talked about is true, that it doesn't come across like, oh, that guy, he's horrible. You don't want to have anything to do with him, right? Because you had one bad experience one time 6 years ago, right? I did something this morning that I had to call back the person and apologize for. Literally this morning, I'm not kidding, on a 9:30 call, right? Stuff happens. People are imperfect, right? And people in our business, especially when they have high D or high I personalities, they're either aggressive or take things personally. And when you mix those two behavioral traits in a transaction, sometimes you get arguments, right? So make sure that the sellers know how relevant the information really is versus I just wanted to give you this thought, even though it happened 6 years ago. You do have a duty to disclose any relevant, pertinent information that could help them make a decision. And so if that's going to rest on you as to what you believe that information is. Okay, so remember, we are the options people, and I know it's 2 o'clock, so we're probably going to run about 7 minutes long. So some of you I know have to depart. I'll wish you a good afternoon and see you later. We are the options people, right? And so we offer options to our sellers and they choose the best path. The options that can be worked with are as follows. If you have multiple offers, you can pick one offer. And when I say you, I mean the seller can pick one offer and start to negotiate that and hold all the other ones aside until or unless you get to that point of accepting the one offer. So just because there's 5 offers on the table, the sellers have no obligation to negotiate with 5 sellers. Some sellers don't like that. Some sellers feel an obligation to work with the first person to the table. You know what? They came first. If they will pay us and whatever we want and get the terms right, we want to sell it to them because they were first to the table. That's just as valid, right? You can work with some or all of the offers at the exact same time, right? And you can do that individually. I find this to be very confusing as a listing agent. If I have 4 different offers and I'm going back one-on-one with each of them to see where everybody stands instead of doing it en masse, I find that to be a little confusing. So I don't love that option, and yet it is an option. And of course, option number 3, work with a singular response to all parties, right? You can go back to all parties. Just because you go back to all parties does not mean it has to be the term that I can't stand, highest and best. I'll tell you why I don't like that phrase in a minute. Right? You can go back if the property's on for $599 and there's 5 different offers out there, you can go back and counter everybody without saying that we're putting something final on the table. You can go back and counter everybody at $598 if nobody's above asking. You can go back and counter everybody at $615. Maybe you have an offer that came in at $605 and another one that's at asking price. and your offer is $5.99, you can go back and counter at $6.15 if that's what the seller chooses to do, right? So I'm just giving you scenarios that sometimes I get calls about saying, can we do it this way? The answer is, as long as you're within the lines of honesty and legality, sure, you can do whatever the seller chooses to do. Let's talk about the highest and best conversation to shortcut some of the listing side conversations here. I don't believe that highest and best serves the seller, the term that is. And I don't believe it serves the seller because I think that when you say the term highest and best to buyer's agents, they instinctively go back to their sellers, to their buyers, and say the exact same thing. And now it feels like a squeeze play. And buyers themselves start to feel like they're getting squeezed. Instead, what I would encourage you to do is go back to each of the buyer's agents. If the seller has decided they want to do one kind of either a counter en masse, or I'm not countering anybody, I want anyone to come back, right? The highest and best version. I like the script that goes like this. Hey, Linda, this is Rick Scott. On 123 Main Street, the seller is going back to each and every buyer's agent to communicate to each and every buyer that they would like to give everyone, there's 4 other viable offers on the table besides yours. The sellers would like to give everyone an opportunity to make any adjustments to price or terms that you might want to make to be considered by 6 o'clock this evening. If we don't hear from you by 6 o'clock this evening, we'll assume that the offer that you have on the table will stand. And if we do, with any adjustments of price or terms, then the sellers will consider the new price and terms, right? This way it feels like a one-on-one, not a big en masse. And what I'm hopefully doing to the buyer's agent is modeling for them what I personally would like them to say to their buyers. Now, you have no control over that. And yet, if you say it well, sometimes the buyer's agents kind of hear that and think, oh, that's not a bad way to communicate that. And so you're modeling how you want to communicate that information. I find that you get more positive feedback from multiple offers, from buyers in multiple offer situations, without that highest and best gun to the head version. And instead offer an opportunity, because now it sounds like we're doing you a favor, right? We're coming back and giving you the opportunity to make any adjustments in price and terms that you might want to be considered. And it just keeps things calmer. It keeps things a little less dramatic, at least in my opinion.
One quick question, please.
Yes.
If you go back with this without the 6 p.m., so in other words, the seller is going back to each and every one individually, giving them the opportunity to make any adjustments, but you don't give them a cutoff time.
Yeah, I don't love that, only because there's no real way to control it then, right? It starts to spin out of control. Somebody was getting on a plane, somebody had to do this, somebody had to do that. I think having some kind of a deadline brings people, because what you want to do, remember, time is no one's friend in a negotiation. I know sometimes people say things like, I think we'll sleep on it overnight. Time is almost never your friend in a negotiation. You want to move things quickly and get everyone to agree or disagree and then move forward. So not having a deadline, I think, just allows people to kind of drutz along. You know that word, drutz? Right? They just kind of hang out, and there's no real incentive or urgency to get back to the seller. I think personally you want to have a time frame on it. Remember, communication is key. Over communicate with buyer's agents. You want everyone to feel like they were treated fairly, even if they lose. Over communicate. If you're going back and telling everybody that 6 o'clock tonight is what we're looking for, by 3 or 4 o'clock, I would be on the phone with all the buyer's agents again saying, hey, I just wanted to remind you, we do have revised terms from 2 of the 5 so far. We wanted to just remind you that, right, be over communicative, be their friend, have them feel like you are on their side so that they can continue to communicate that way to the buyer, because that's what's in the best interest of the seller. Yes, Dawn.
So when you get the question about, is one of those offers yours, like when you're the listing agent, what's the proper response? Or I mean, should we be asking that question? I mean, I don't typically, because I don't really think it matters. I mean, but I get the question, and I've heard other people say that.
Yeah. So I will tell you that I'm kind of with you on that. I don't think it's relevant, right? I think so if the question is, as buyer's agents, should we be asking it? You certainly can ask it. I think the only thing that information does, because once you have the information, right, you now have an obligation to let the buyer know that the listing agent represents one of the offers. And so all you're doing now is creating discord in the whole transaction, because now the buyer feels like they're being somehow, you know, given short shrift or manipulated in some way, or they're at a disadvantage. Part of the reason that some buyers have decided that they get the best deal by going straight to the listing agent, we made that happen. We made that happen by creating this environment where people felt like they weren't being fairly treated if they weren't dealing with the listing agent, right? So I didn't ask it. I wouldn't ask it today as a buyer's agent, because I also think just asking the question hints at the listing agent that somehow you distrust them. And I don't think that plays well for you or your buyer client, right? So, and on the listing agent side, do people ask it? Yes. Does the Code of Ethics say that we have to answer that question? If asked, yes. And so if asked, do you represent one of the, one or more of the buyers, or whatever they ask, answer it with a yes or no answer. Honestly, yes, I do. I'm curious, when can we expect to hear back from your buyers? Or no, I don't. When can we expect to hear back from your buyers? Again, it's not a commentary. There's no reason to have a conversation around it. It's a yes or no answer to a question. Answer honestly, always. Like, lying is never a good path for anybody. Answer honestly and move on from it. Does that help with that?
It does.
And I couldn't agree with you more that I think it's an irrelevant piece of information. I'm not sure why NAR caved and added it to the Code of Ethics. They did that like 5 years ago. I think it's kind of silly. Now, does everyone play by the rules? No. But the fact that it's in the Code of Ethics or not in the Code of Ethics, if people don't play by the rules, they're not going to play by the Code of Ethics anyway. So like, what was the point of including it? And just remember, guys, you're not the real estate police either, right? Do we have agents in our community who don't 100% play by the rules 100% of the time? Yes, that's just real. That's called life, right? You have that in every industry, in every aspect of your life. There are people who play by the rules and people who don't. You just have to do the best job that you can possibly do and maintain your own integrity and not worry about the integrity of everybody else, because you have no control over it, right? You have to continue to push forward knowing that you're doing the best job that you can possibly do and keeping yourself between the lines.
I have a question.
Yeah.
The deal falls apart, multiple offers fall apart, everything falls apart, the listing falls apart, it gets canceled.
Yes.
The listing agent, am I obliged to answer any questions for the agent who actually lost the bid after the listing is canceled and everything is on the table?
Like what kind of question?
Like they lost and they would like to know why they lost, what happened with the listing, why is it off the table, all these kind of questions.
Yeah, no. The answer is, unfortunately, I'm not at liberty to discuss that. You could certainly write a letter to the seller, and if the seller chose to answer it, you could get your information that way, right? But, right, remember, guys, there's a level of objectivity here that you need to maintain. And just because someone asks something, and then Jody's going to go, just because somebody asks something doesn't mean that they necessarily deserve an answer or a long answer, right? Too many of us fall into the trap of, well, they said this to me, or they asked that of me. Who cares? Right? Sometimes the answer is just, I appreciate your curiosity. Unfortunately, I'm unable to disclose that. The sellers did make a difficult choice, and they did go in this direction. Have a lovely afternoon. Let's do lunch. Bye. Yes, ma'am.
Doesn't your fiduciary responsibility go beyond the expiration of the listing also?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So from the perspective of confidentiality, you're just not at liberty to have that discussion, right? And don't overdo it by saying, okay, I'm going to go back to the seller now, ask if I can disclose it. Just handle it, right? Handle it, cut it off. Thanks so much. Let's move on. Sometimes people just need to ask the question, right? It's like taking the listing where you're asking for 6% and the seller says, is there any way you'll reduce your commission? And you'll say, no, not this go around. And they say, oh, okay, well, I had to ask. Contract is signed and they move on, right? Sometimes people just feel like they have to ask. Any other things that we should be talking about that we didn't? Any questions that you might have on either the buyer or the listing side in terms of multiple offers? Did we cover enough strategies to help out? We're good? Did you learn something? You're going to win your multiple offer scenarios? Good deal, right? Use this stuff because I find that it works. It doesn't work 100% of the time, and yet it works a lot of the time. So use the stuff we talked about. They're good strategies, and they will keep you and your buyers on top, which is where you want to come out. Guys, have a great afternoon. We'll see you at 4:30. I look forward to it.